Afternoon, everyone. It's 12:30. As we do in the past, we do try and give people a few minutes to join us. We have quite a large number of registrations for today, and although we don't expect everybody to join us today, we're expecting a few more people, so we'll give them a minute for Wayne to also open the door for them to come through, and then I will start. Good afternoon, Frick. I see you online with us as well, and thanks for making the note to remind our guests to put their comments and their questions in the public chat. That's what it's there for, so please make good use of it. Frick is going to keep his eye on your contributions and your observations, and we'll incorporate that in the discussion for today as well.
Thank you, Anna-Marie. Will do.
Thank you. Thanks, Frick. It's, I think, 12:31 here on my side of the world. So let's maybe kick off in the interest of time. First of all, as always, hearty warm welcome on behalf of Fluid Rock and the Stellenbosch Graduate Institute to our Directors Hour, which is again promising to be an interesting and a thought-provoking discussion. We really enjoy this opportunity we have to share some of these topics and thinking with you. And I think today is not going to be any different. And we're very honored to have Associate Professor Owen Skae with us today from Rhodes. I'm going to introduce him just now as well. I think if I remember correctly, you're an associate professor at Rhodes Business School in wonderful Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. And I think, if I remember correctly as well, the Rhodes Business School, particularly known for its focus on leadership for sustainability, and specifically looking at the 4E model of economics, equity, ethics, and ecology. Owen himself is absolutely an acknowledged expert in corporate governance and also ethical leadership. He's written widely as an academic as well, and is also frequently called on to comment on governance-related matters, particularly also in the public sector. Owen has served as the president of the South African Business Schools Association from, I think, 2014 to 2016. He was a non-executive director at PwC Business School. Currently, he's a non-executive chair at GBS Mutual Bank. He's also a non-executive director of the Good Governance Academy, which is a wonderful initiative that was started by Professor King to also influence the content material for, in particularly, MBA students, and to get business schools on board to make sure that we have get the right message and understanding across around corporate governance. And so I think that makes today's topic that much more important and relevant, because there seems to be still quite a big misunderstanding. Professor Owen Skae, not long ago, I think, threw the cat among the pigeons, and if I remember correctly, Owen, it's also not the first time, when you wrote an article on this topic, and you particularly highlighted the fact that some of our journalists do not seem to understand King and governance and the law. And you tried, as I said in the little write-up, I thought I was very impressed with the way, especially considering you're a non-lawyer, as you've pointed out yourself, the way that you explained the link between governance and the law. But unfortunately, your article and your very good attempt didn't go unpunished. And so another journalist, Chris Logan, responded quite harshly to your article. And I think, that just again, looking at these discussions and the debates and the arguments that were raised in the articles, myself, a couple of years ago, probably last year, it feels like years ago already, I wrote an article, and the heading was, "Is corporate governance overrated in South Africa?" And it was in response to apparently a comment that was made that Steinhoff is another example that the King report is of little value. And I'm getting quite a bit frustrated with these observations being made, and King 4 being made out to be the culprit in all of this. So I really enjoyed, obviously for those reasons, enjoyed your article. But it's very evident for me that there is definitely, and whether this is, consciously so or innocently so, there is still a fair amount of misunderstanding around King 4, what the purpose is of the King report, and how it links to the law. So with that little bit of an intro, Owen, I'm going to give the floor to you and would appreciate if you can just, maybe let's start the debate with you having an opportunity to just explain, your reasoning and the points that you were trying to make in your article. Welcome and thank you for your time with us today as well.
Right, thank you, Anna-Marie, for the introduction, and thank you to Fleur Rock and Stellenbosch Graduate Institute for hosting me today. It's a great pleasure to come in from Makanda, Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. And as Anna-Marie said, I wrote this article because there were a number of misconceptions around corporate governance, King 4 code and the law. And I felt that it's important that we need to clarify these matters. Now, one can understand that when businesses fail, people lose money and they understandably are angry. And very often that anger spills over into reasons and justifications and clarification for why certain things need to be done. But as I pointed out in the article, we can't mix a self-regulatory code with what the law says. I think we need to just touch on a few things here. So if you are a director of a company, then there are certain separate yet related and integrated mechanisms, policies, laws, compliance, regulations that one has to be very mindful of. So at the first instance, you've got the Companies Act, for example. You've got legislation, then you've got the common law, and that is where the judges have to make rulings based on issues that come before them, and often the legislators have not necessarily foreseen what might have happened or anticipated that. And therefore, the judges have to make a ruling. And that becomes what we would term the common law. Then there are certain regulations, compliance issues that may not necessarily be written in the law, but these are things that you need to do. And what we are discovering is that increasingly those are becoming quite significant, at times very onerous. Then you've got what we'd call a self-regulatory code, which is the King 4 code, and it's gone through various, from King 1, King 2, King 3, King 4. We also need to acknowledge that the basis upon which King has evolved has changed. So King 2 was what we referred to as comply or explain. And essentially, the concern around the comply or explain was that contributed to a tick box type of mentality. And it's very much the situation in the US, for example, where they have a comply or else. The Enron scandal, which is something I wrote about in that article. And for me, it was a little bit of a deja vu. And I made reference to a really excellent piece that was written by a law academic, Bratton. And he shows you through the entire what happened at Enron, and he makes reference to what we would call the ex ante and the ex post. So ex ante is you're trying to anticipate what's going to happen, and then you find that after the fact, the ex post analysis, in hindsight, we can always be quite wise about perhaps things that we should have done. But as I made the point there, he himself said that even with what happened in Enron, it didn't justify significant changing to the self-regulatory code, because then you have the compliance yield factor, and that then would compromise really what the essence of enterprise is, which is to create value. And I'll come back to that later. So Enron then led to a whole raft of regulation, Sarbanes-Oxley and so on. But we had the global financial crisis after that. And I think the view of the King Committee was that it's this compliance tick box quantitative governance type of approach that in fact itself is probably going to have an even greater counter effect to what it is that we're trying to achieve. And as Bratton pointed out, Enron themselves, they had the audit committee, they had all the meetings. In fact, the chair of the audit committee was an eminent professor, I think, from Stanford University. And despite all that, they were able to do the kinds of financial hieroglyphics and shenanigans that they did. So anyway, King Committee then came to apply or explain, which was King 3. And the change to King 4 was apply and explain. I think my interpretation, I'm not part of the King Committee, but my interpretation was that under King 3, you had a situation where companies were applying and then explaining what they weren't doing. So stakeholders saying, well, if you're just telling us what you're not doing, we'd also like to know what you are doing. And hence, King 4, the regime is now apply and explain. I'll come back to that again just now. So just to recap, there's the law, the legislation, the common law, there's the regulations and compliance issues that are not necessarily law, but they're things that you have to do, the self-regulatory codes, and then there's your professional ethics. And probably you would find in the room today a lot of chartered accountants, lawyers, who yourself are bound by codes of ethics. And often when you're sitting around a boardroom table and you have this professional requirement to uphold, how do you balance all of these things? Now, the evolution of companies, and I'd really strongly recommend that if you have not read Andrew Haldane's speech that he gave in 2015 about who owns a company, for me it should be compulsory reading for any person who's in a corporate governance role, because he very succinctly explains the establishment of what was prior to that unlimited liability to limited liability. And then I think he says around 1855, you cross the Rubicon into what then became limited liability. And in fact, the middle class, the wealthy investors, it suited them to do that, because prior to that, if the company went bankrupt, there was unlimited liability and the creditors could come after everybody. And so Britain was going through the industrialization phase. We needed to have economic growth. And so people sat down and said, well, look, if we set up these companies and there's unlimited liability, who's actually going to invest? And so the concept of limited liability came to be. And that in itself then triggered economic development and economic growth, which subsequently later on, decades later, Professor Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, he's generally attributed to the idea that the only social responsibility of business is to make a profit, and the profit maximization maxim should apply. So we come to today, and I just, in preparation for this, I just want to read out the names of a few companies, and I'm pretty sure that Siemens, these are major corporate scandals. Siemens in Germany, Dieselgate in Germany, Wirecard in Germany, recently Luckin Coffee, which is a Chinese coffee company that had a secondary listing on the NASDAQ, FIFA. We've got Tyrannos and Elizabeth Holmes, the Australian banks, You can just Google the sort of malfeasance and behavior that happened there. It's actually quite mind-boggling. 23 million cases of money laundering, overcharging clients, and so on. Barclays, the Forex scandal. And very often when I teach ethical organization as a module, I will say to my MBA students, look, just go on to News 24 now and click on it, and I guarantee you will find there's some company somewhere that somebody's done something, some director, and sure as nuts it happens. So of course, these things give governance a bad name. And in this case, the article that was written said, this is the fault of King 4. Now, we need to separate these out. King 4 is a self-regulatory code. If you go and look at Section 76 of the Companies Act, it's very clear that the board is accountable to the company. I'm still quite shocked. I must be honest and frank with you that I come into contact with many directors, some of whom are listed companies, who will say that the board is accountable to the shareholders. And we don't even have to talk about King 4 here, because Section 76 is very clear that the board of directors is accountable to the company. You have a fiduciary responsibility to good faith, care, skill, and diligence, and you're accountable to the company. And the way that we define accountability is that you can't delegate this responsibility away. Now, how does it mean that we are accountable to something that is essentially, can't think for itself, but it's a person, it's a juristic person, and the law recognizes it as being a person. And as Professor Mervyn King has pointed out on many occasions, you can't own a person. Slavery was abolished. Sadly, it still exists in certain parts of the world, but slavery has essentially been abolished. And therefore, you can't own a company. So when we sit around the boardroom table and talk about the owners, the company is a person and it cannot be owned. But a company issues shares, and shareholders own those shares. And that gives them certain rights in relation to that. And that is that you come to an AGM, you pass resolutions, and in fact, shareholders have the right to get the directors out of the company. However, I, as a shareholder of a certain company, doesn't give me the right to go into that company and take something out of it. That would be theft. And what we often find, I use the analogy of family businesses. Very often, mom and dad may have started a business, and then the time comes to the succession planning to hand over to other family members. And the family members then end up fighting amongst themselves, and the business gets destroyed in the process. So just because you own something doesn't necessarily always mean that you act in its best interest. And so if you have this incapacitated being, this juristic person, that it owns assets in its own name, it can't think for itself, it needs a board to be the heart, mind, and soul of the organization. But and perhaps I'm being a little bit philosophical here, but if I could imagine that if this company could think for itself and I was able to engage in a discussion with it, I imagine that it would tell us that I really want to be sure what my purpose is. And my purpose is to be a responsible corporate citizen. I want to do good in the world. I would want to make sure that our customers are delighted when they engage with us, that people that work for us are proud to work for us, that we pay our taxes, that at the end of the day, we give a fair return to the shareholders, because there are these 6 capitals. And King 4, and in fact it was King 3 already, said that shareholder maximization is a short-term, in fact it's contributed to many ills in society. And we have to acknowledge that whether we like it or not, at the current rate of consumption, we need 1.25 planets to sustain us. probably in my lifetime too, at current rates of consumption, we'll need two planets to sustain us. So we are consuming resources faster than we can replenish them. And some people argue, and that was the Linstad article that I referred to, that this profit maximization model is taking us down a path that future generations will look back and say, you know, this generation had the opportunity to make the change and it didn't. So King 4 is around mindful outcomes. In other words, it talks about principles based and on followed outcomes as opposed to a rules-based approach. So what are these 4 outcomes? Not rules, outcomes based on principles. And you apply the principles and you explain the practice. And very quickly, these outcomes on ethical culture, so-called ICRAFT, integrity, competence, responsibility, accountability, fairness, and transparency on an apply and explain basis. Then the second outcome is good performance. It's really around value creation. Now, in my view, King has never said that we don't want companies to perform well. We want companies to perform well. We want them to be good corporate citizens. And in fact, what we need to do is we need to take the 6 capitals, and these are the inputs through a value creation process called your business model. You have certain outputs and outcomes that at the end actually do no harm, but we have to acknowledge that shareholder primacy, the financial capital part of it, does not enjoy any greater significance than any of the other capitals. However, if we end up in a situation where the company is financially unsustainable, then clearly it's not going to be sustainable itself. So the challenge to board members is to, in an integrated way, think about how we're going to perform well in a way that natural capital isn't compromised. So our water resources are preserved. We have clean air and so on. That in South Africa, we have tremendous social inequality. If we think that we can continue to operate in a bubble and ultimately our Gini coefficient is the level to which it is, our intellectual capital, our human capital, and so on. The challenge around this is, yes, how do we create this good performance? But King is not prescriptive in telling you how you should conduct your business model. King says that we think it's a really good idea that as board members, you think about what good performance means. And I think that there we can acknowledge the work of IFAC, for example, if you International Federation of Accountants, if you go and look at their website as recently as the 26th of August, they're talking about inclusiveness, inequality. If we think about Mervyn King talks about the chief value officer, particularly in relation to the chief financial officer, and arguing that the chief financial officer has a critical role. And in fact, Mervyn King would prefer that the chief financial officer is renamed as the chief value officer. So we do acknowledge in there that in the midst of these 6 capitals is that how we manage the finances of the organization, how we, from the input through the business model to the output and outcome itself, can be a tremendous creative value. Then the third outcome is effective control. And here I really love the work of Michael Mutakrishna, who's a professor at the London School of Economics and also a professor of behavioral economics in the US, Professor Dan Ariely. I just want to briefly talk about these 2 academics. So Michael Mutakrishna, he's done a lot of games, gaming theory, and you know, sadly, what he shows is that when you play a particular game and you insert bribery into it, it very quickly leads to a breakdown of the system. And in fact, he even goes so far as to say that often what we find is that corruption is encoded within our DNA, and it probably is due to a survival mechanism that goes back through the millennia as human beings have evolved, is that we've had to put up these defense mechanisms. And so in some countries, nepotism is seen to be perfectly, that's the way it should be done. In other countries and other cultures, nepotism is a big no-no. And what we've learned over the centuries is that we have to sacrifice certain freedoms. If you want to be somebody who can just do whatever you like, whenever you like, and then you want to go and live in a forest somewhere, then you must accept the fact that you may get eaten by a wild animal. So what humans did is that they got together because they recognized that the risk of me getting eaten by a wild animal is reduced if I now form into a group. So we have the group protection. But then the group says, no, but we don't like the fact that that you just go and hunt whenever you like. So we have this pendulum, and societies evolve based on certain perceptions of individual freedom in terms of what's the collective responsibility. And so if we look at the work of Dan Ariely, Dan says that, and I don't think that this is necessarily empirically proven, but he says something like, 1% of us are absolutely incorruptible. Is that if we left a ton of gold in a room and it was unlocked, those 1% would never touch it. So you actually don't need to worry about them at all. 1% of people are really evil to the core. They are absolutely corruptible, and it doesn't matter what safeguards or checks and balances you build around them. They'll find a way to get into the building and steal the gold. So there's the 98% of us which are in between. And always the temptation is there for us to do certain things. And Philip Zimbardo, who was behind the Stanford prison experiment, he written a book called The Lucifer Effect and Why Good People Do Bad Things. And it's very complex, the human condition. But coming back to Mutakrishna and coming back to Dan Ariely, what they talk about then is having strong institutions that, and for those of you, obviously all scholars of governance, the control aspect, internal controls, that management is the first line of defense, that the auditors, the internal auditors, previously we used to talk about 3 lines of defense. Now I think it's growing to 6 or 7 lines of defense. So if you don't have this effective control, then you do run the risk that the 98% are going to resort to perhaps some kind of behavior that's not necessarily in the best interest of the company. So in fact, we should welcome these things. It's not anything to shy away from. And therefore, the King Committee, the notion of independence is extremely important, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The last outcome is around legitimacy. And King has often said that it's the stakeholders who are the ultimate compliance officers. So nowhere does King 4 say that we mustn't be responsible. In fact, we should be responsive and responsible in relation to how we engage with our stakeholders. But we have to acknowledge that often stakeholders may make competing demands on the business, and therefore it's the collective mindset of the board that has to balance these stakeholder expectations, particularly when you're having to manage a business, the executive team, managing the business in the short term over the medium to the long term. Because really what it is that we're striving for is sustainable value over the long term. So just to recap, King 4 is about principles-based outcomes as opposed to rules. It's not about a tick box mentality. It's about having a board that is saying we're accountable to the company. And in theory, if we're acting in the best interest of the company, the long-term sustainability of the company should align to what the long-term expectations of the stakeholders are. And so if we look at the Business Roundtable in the US, they themselves are talking about sustainability. Shareholder maximization is no longer the way of the past, and that if we're wanting to build an inclusive global world, the sustainable development goals, we need to give recognition to those things. So the article was quite hard in saying that if you're a shareholder, you stand at the back of the queue. That is rooted in history. King does not make the law. That would be overreach. And I came across a very interesting case where I think it was related to Section 252 of the Companies Act, where you end up being investing in a fund. So in effect there's a nominee. You're not shown as the shareholder in terms of the register. And this was to do with I think DRD Gold. And so the minority shareholders who were not shown in the share register because they were in nominees, they sued Investec and said, we need you to make good on what we've done. And if you read the court case, the judge says there that this was 9 days of sitting and trying to understand what the Companies Act says about members. But at the end, the bad news was that if your name does not appear in the register, then there's nothing that can be done for you. What you should have done was you should have sold out and then bought the share directly in the company. But the point in there, the judge said, in terms of the interpretation, if we interpret it in the way that some people are coming here and arguing that you want us to interpret, the judge said this would be absurd because we would be going into the realm of the legislature. And as a judge, I am not permitted to do that. I am not permitted to make that law. You have to go to Parliament. So this is where we need to have these checks and balances. And this is where King 4 stresses the importance of independence. Now, all directors have to be independent of mind. You're duty bound to do this. But if you think about Dan Ariely, if you think about Michael Mutakrishna, we have to acknowledge that we need executive directors because those are the directors who are there for the day-to-day operations of the company. King Committee has decided that its recommendation is that we have a unitary board system in South Africa, unlike Germany, which has a 2-tier board structure. And therefore, the balance of power on the board has to be understood. And so we need to have executives, non-executives, and independent non-executives. And this is not contrary to what is practiced in many other countries around the world. So on that score, King looked around the world and said that we're not at odds. Now, in the US, yes, you can be the CEO and you can be the chair of the board. Recently, you may recall that Elon Musk, he was tweeting out things that some people took offense to, and Tesla decided that he should no longer be the chair of the board. So it's not unreasonable to say that even in the US, you've got a non-executive chair and then you've got the CEO. But yes, there are cases where it's common practice in the US that, but insofar as the majority of the board being independent, South Africa is no different to other countries. Now, when we talk about Steinhoff, Steinhoff is it originally was, primary listing was on the JSE, then it went and listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and it follows the Dutch governance code. And I've written quite a lot about Steinhoff. And if one reads the integrated report in relation to Steinhoff, you don't actually see King 4 mentioned in there too often. And I recently came across an article which was to do with the transaction where I think Pepkor was being sold and Christo Visa, and essentially the money was loaned. And the point that the article made is that the way that transaction was conducted was perfectly legal under Dutch law, but would not be allowed in South Africa. So when you have companies that operate in multiple jurisdictions, it obviously becomes a much more complex thing. And one can understand that in relation to Steinhoff, you want to have quick justice. Now, if you look at the Wirecard example, and the amazing thing again is that the CEO said, no, it wasn't us, we didn't know what was going on. In 2018, Wirecard replaced Commerce Bank in the DAX 30. But literally a couple of weeks later, their share price shot down by 40%. And interestingly enough, BA Fin, which is a regulator in Germany, banned the short sellers from acting. So you have a regulator stepping in. The short sellers are now starting to sell the shares, and the regulator says stop. Let's recall Viceroy and Steinhoff. What happened with Viceroy is that they shorted Steinhoff. Did anybody listen to what Viceroy was doing? Viceroy then targeted a few other companies, and we had a big panic in relation to that. I also wanted to highlight Tongaat Hewlett. There was an analyst at Investec called Anthony Geard, and he said, we think it is time that the CEO steps down because of the appalling financial results. Subsequent to that, Investec issued an apology to the then CEO. They said, this is not the view of the Investec Corporation. What we have in South Africa is that the National Prosecuting Authority has been hollowed out. These commercial crimes are very difficult to prove. I also was interested to see that if you look at the Criminal Procedure Act, there's provisions in there for suing directors. But what was interesting there is that in the Criminal Procedure Act, the presumption is that you're guilty until innocent. That was then taken to the Constitutional Court, who said that cannot be. This part of the Criminal Procedure Act is unconstitutional because the presumption of innocence must prevail. So this is what makes these commercial crime very, very difficult to prosecute. There is no police force that's got blue lights whizzing around, says King on the side. There's no obligation for the King Committee to go and audit companies. What King does is it provides a guideline, a framework. It says, Section 76 of the Companies Act says that you should do this. The basic conditions of employment says you should do this. The Employment Equity Act says that you should do this. Anti-money laundering, POCA, all of these things. So we have got a framework that suggests and recommends on a mindful outcomes, principles-based approach, this is what you should be doing. The fact that some companies greenwash, if you look at the Siemens case, Siemens signed up to Transparency International, everything looked fantastic on paper. The fact that you've got board members who would be deemed to be predator fraudsters, not accidental fraudsters. We have to acknowledge that, yes, thinking about the 98%, but at the end, it's not just about the ethical culture. Ethical culture will only go so far. There have been cases where companies have tried to just do the ethical part, others have tried to do the rules. We need to have something that addresses both the ethical as well as the conformance, the performance, the conformance, the legitimacy. And so King says we have to find this middle ground. We are not against taking risks. We think that you need to identify what your appetite for risk is. You need to take risks in order to grow your business. And as long as you do it in good faith, and as long as you have got a board that is diverse, understands the industry, is independent in thinking, and is really solely motivated by acting the best interest of the company, that we follow the stakeholder inclusive approach, which is what the King Committee recommends should be done in South Africa. Ideally, we should create the kind of sustainable value that we're looking for. So, Anna-Marie, I think I'll stop there. And if there's, obviously, happy to engage further now.
Thank you. And this was, I was like 12 months listening to you, and I was thinking of I can behave now like my grandson and sing and dance and say, he's got it. You've got it. I wish more people can bear it. So thank you for that. You really gave us some good food for thought, and you made me think that the King report and companies actually share a similar challenge. And the challenge is that both companies and the King report are dependent on human beings. I'm sorry to say that. That's the reality. As much as a company does not have a mind and a soul of itself and is dependent on people to give it back, the King report is dependent on ethical people, ethical leaders, people who understand, who want to actually, make this company into a long-term success. And that is the frustration for me personally, especially as I move around in so many boardrooms in this country, in public sector and private sector, and I see all the window dressing, I see all the misunderstanding, the fronting around governance, et cetera, et cetera. It really frustrates me a lot. Now, one of the points I wanted to just raise with you is the article that you were commenting on particularly highlighted the flight or the plight of shareholders, losing out because of these rogue directors, and that they should be able to do much more, etc. Now, to your point, if you really understand what the role of the board is, that the board is that controlling mind of the company, its main role is to ensure the long-term sustainability of the company. And you made the point as well, for those of the stakeholders that are in it for the long run, theoretically, then it should be in their interest as well. So you've got these different sort of groups of stakeholders, and whoever is in the group, of course, changes from day to day as well. I mean, I quoted, on the JSE, institutional investors on average stays in our share registers for 6 months. And many years ago, I'm reminded of a decision in a boardroom where, the decision was, do we pay 750 or approve capital expenditure of 750 million rand to clean up some of our environmental problems? Because in 5 or 10 years from now, this may be important for us to continue and to survive. Or do we take the money and we pay it out to shareholders? Now, the shareholders at the time, what would they have said? The majority of them, they said, give us a dividend, because it's not that serious to them whether this business is still around in 5 or 10 years from now. So it's like you make the point about balance. It's a constant balancing act that a board has to make to focus and keep that North Star is, let's ensure the long-term sustainability of this company. How do we do that? And we consider the interest of all of these different stakeholders. We balance these interests to actually try and achieve that kind of outcome. And this is then where King comes in. King says, guys, if that's what you want to do, then here is a framework. If you want to be diligent, prudent directors who's not always going to get it right, you're not issued with a glass ball. You're going to get it wrong. But if you got it wrong, in spite of being diligent and prudent, then the law gives you some reprieve. And here is something that will guide you in how to act prudently and diligently. So just talk to me a little bit about shareholders and this focus that the articles had on that shareholders should be supreme.
Yes, so Anna-Marie, clearly Milton Friedman, his view really had a profound impact. And it's very hard sometimes to undo that. And so when one talks about the shareholder being the owner of the company, and I say to my students, imagine if every day we walked into the company and we were told when we walked through the door, today you're here for the shareholder. Everything you're doing is for the shareholder. Now, that is what happened at Enron. Enron was so aggressive in pursuing shareholder returns that Bratton actually makes reference to the point that there were instances where members of the Enron that were lower down in the organization were breaking company policy in relation to doing certain things. But in fact, when they were achieving the overreach on the targets, they were highlighted as the heroes and the champions. So you had these contradictory messages. Now, if one thinks about Enron and the employees, at some point, I think some 90%, employees, 90% of their retirement savings were invested into Enron. So it wasn't just the shareholders that were compromised. There are many stakeholders here. Now, when limited liability says, I stand at the back of the queue, I carry the highest risk, so human nature is that I expect and require the highest level of return. I understand that. There are risks involved, and companies are having to take risks. So as a shareholder, you need to be vigilant. You need to read the integrated report. There's some fantastic work that's been done on Sasol and looking at Sasol's integrated report, which shows that, in fact, it was so complicated. But in there, Sasol made no reference to their customers. And they benchmarked it against a company in Europe, which showed a much greater recognition of that company in Europe in relation to its shareholders. Now, I've been tracking Sasol over the last 4 or 5 years and using the integrated report and showing increasingly that the debt burden was increasing. Now, Finance 101, we teach Finance 101 that if you borrow too much, then you run the risk of failure. And then with Sasol, it obviously was the perfect storm. So Lake Charles project management problems, some people say it was down to climate change. In fact, recently, they criticized the company because of the big payout that's going. There's a famous case in the US, the Walt Disney case, where the chief operating officer was given a payout of millions and millions. And the shareholders got obviously very upset about this. So they went to court and they said it's unacceptable that this chap came here and he's been here for whatever, a few months, and now you're paying him out with millions. And interestingly, the judges said, and they applied the business judgment rule, they said that we are not experts in business. We are judges. So we have to assume that the board applied its mind. And there must have been a very good reason as to why they paid that chief operating officer that amount. Now, it could have been that he was employed in order to do something, and then 6 months into the job, the board said, no, we're actually not happy with what you've come up with. But he said, in all good faith, I've done exactly what you asked me to do. The fact that you don't like what I've done now doesn't mean that you can just fire me. So they obviously had to make a deal. The judges said that we are not going to interfere in that. Now, if you had a situation that the board was accountable to the shareholders, that means that every shareholder can come and knock on the CEO's door. I can pitch up every day and bang on the CEO's door and say, hey, you're accountable to me. If you end up being accountable to everybody, you're accountable to nobody. So shareholders, you take your money, you buy a share. If the company fails, and of course, nobody wants a company to fail. And I guess is it more painful when it's due to corruption and malfeasance, or is it more painful when it's due to just, we misread the market altogether? Either way, it's extremely painful. The law says, if you actually, did a good thing in good faith, then that's, and nobody is accusing Sasol of any corruption. In relation to Steinhoff, of course, there are many, many red flags around that. And I guess the frustration is, why is this not happening? Why is the former CEO not coming before court? Why is he not in an orange overall? As the shareholder, why can I not? But the law has said, as I say, you can't have your cake and eat it. The company must be the one to recover the money. And there are certain exceptions where you may. Recently, we are involved in another webinar. The question was raised around private prosecution. That question was asked to Professor King. He said that, yes, he's pretty sure there'd be people lining up to do private prosecution, but the National Prosecuting Authority has to issue a certificate saying that it's not going to prosecute. Because as it stands right now in South Africa, the state monopolizes that. It monopolizes criminal prosecution. So King 4 is not about to set up a private prosecuting agency, as I said. So where we as boards need to do our jobs is King says, when you write your integrated report, put it into language that people understand. Let's not have a 300-page document. IFRS 9 is probably, IFRS 9, my understanding, and I'm not a chartered accountant, but IFRS 9 is unintelligible to CAs who qualified 30 years ago. Maybe, but you put a 5-year CA who can understand IFRS 9, but do they understand the essence of what the business is about? That's where the diversity comes in. So we need to put out integrated reports that are transparent. I made reference to IFAC. If you go and look at IFAC and the G20's transparency principles for the private sector, there's 17 of them there that talk about ethical culture, internal controls. They even make reference to SMEs. King 4 has definitely attempted to be more inclusive. It talks about proportionality. It acknowledges that it probably everything to do in King 4, probably the listed company are the only ones that have the resources in order to do that. But King 4 can be for everybody. It can be for an SME, an NGO. It can be for a church grouping. In fact, Rhodes University itself says that, our council says that we will apply and explain King 4 on a proportionality basis. So I think people need to really get behind the philosophy of what it is, understand the law. And if you're in a pension fund, know full well that if your name doesn't appear on the share register and the company goes bang, well, then you need to perhaps look at the fund managers in relation to the kinds of questions that they're asking. And you're within your rights to do that by going to the AGM. So be vigilant, expect transparency. I'm rambling a bit now, but hopefully I've answered your question a bit.
No, you have. And it's really important for people, I think, and this is the message that I was hoping we can get through to people today as well, those on the line and those that will be listening to the recording later on as well, that King 4 is not in itself, by itself book. We can write King 4 till we blue in the face without the right people taking it, understanding it, applying their minds, on a proportional basis, and really buying into the philosophy around sustainable development and the interdependence between, corporates and society. If you don't buy into that, I normally say, please don't waste your time. You can read the King report. I have also seen that the tick box mentality, where people just apply just for the sake of it and not understand why they don't see the benefit, actually has worse consequences for companies than if they just ignore the King report. So I absolutely also want to agree with you that, I don't think it's King 4. If I can share with you my verdict, King 4 is not at fault. It's the people. It's the people, it's the system within which we operate, even without going into the detail of the law. The thinking behind the law is because directors are accountable to the law, the company accountable to the company must then have the right to hold them to account. And if there was any harm done by them, to then recover, and get, a repayment of the damages and the harm that was done. And if the company then recovers and get that restitution, that again is to the benefit of all the stakeholders of the company, that money or whatever it is flows, that harm is undone. That's one of the reasons the law does not want to allow one group of stakeholders to have a particular right, again to the exclusion of other stakeholders. So the company needs to do that. And in fact, our Companies Act have got what's called the derivative action, where as a shareholder or another interested party, I can approach a court of law on behalf of a company where it's obvious that the wrongdoers are still in the boardroom. So there is quite a bit of ammunition and systems and processes in the Act where we as interested parties can act. So from that point of view, the law, that's the way the law, and whether we agree with it or not, that's not the point. To your point, that's what the law says. That's how the law. King 4 comes in to say, for those of you that want to be effective, ethical leaders, here is a framework. Apply your mind. Give it your best shot, and we're trying to help and support you here in the background. And that is all that King 4 is. It's not a magic wand. It's not the solution in its own right. It is completely dependent on people. And if shareholders are uncomfortable with the way directors are doing their job, the law also gives them the right to hire and fire. And they need to then exercise those rights, again, in the interest of the company. Frick, I see you've come on board for the last few minutes to join us. Welcome.
There's a question in the chat that says the company is represented by its directors. Why would people prosecute themselves? Is that not where it fails?
Yeah, so Dr. Steenberg, I think it's a very reasonable question. And of course, if you continue to sit on the board, you're not going to prosecute yourself in effect. But that's where the shareholders need to step up and vote those directors out, which they can do. So it's not that shareholders have no recourse whatsoever. Shareholders have absolute recourse. The new board would presumably then come in and say, hey, we need to sort this out. And that's what Tongaat is doing. So I made that point in the article. Now the point that the counterpoint to my article, and I really welcome that. I thought it was fantastic that Chris Logan took the time to write it, because at the end of the day, we're having a debate about this now. And he said, well, Tongaat's not a good example for King 4 but as I gave Siemens as an example, we can't say that just because Tongaat Hewlett makes constant reference to King 4 at that particular era doesn't mean that the ethical culture, we talk about greenwashing or whatever you want to call it. So Tongaat is doing the right thing now. They are now proceeding against that. And as I said in the article, and Eskom is proceeding too. I think the pressure will hopefully come onto the Steinhoff board now to say, you need to now, Steinhoff is in multiple jurisdictions. Judge Dennis Davis talks about the Stalingrad defense. Very often you've got directors who are very wealthy. They can hire the best lawyer. And this is where the pursuit of the law can be very, very problematic. But there is recourse. I also think we need to note that King 4 is increasingly coming into the common law. And I think that what we're going to find more and more is that people are more sensitive to understanding about ethical culture. If there is malfeasance and you end up being a director's gone after because of gross negligence or gross recklessness, and you end up being hauled before the court, and the judge then says, demonstrate to me, where you did these things, and contrary to that, in terms of the common law. So I think this is where King sets the tone in relation to that. But King is not the law, and it cannot have that overreach.
If I can also just add, and that's where the point about the derivative action comes in. There is an instrument in the company to act where, like the guardian, any interested party has the right in law to approach a court and on behalf of the company, request intervention from and a ruling from a court to actually deal with rogue directors as well. So there are instruments, but it's not being used appropriately and effectively. And sometimes the legal system, to Owen's point, also adds to the frustration of going to court and what that entails and the cost and the time, etc. So there's a lot of things that puts us off. But that does not mean that the instruments and the vehicles are not there to do something.
Yeah, and just a couple of other points. So Johan Rupert made reference to King 58. Now clearly that's a facetious comment that's being made. I wrote an article a couple of years ago where Johan Rupert had made reference to the King Committee being the advocate of mandatory firm rotation, which is not the case. It's URBA that is driving mandatory firm rotation, and it's going to happen in South Africa. So often these things are conflated to say that because it's King that said it. I think that Logan made reference to Koos Becker and regarding non-executive remuneration and using Amazon as an example. Now, if you go and look at Amazon, I think they're called non-employee directors. If you're a director of Amazon, you're obliged to become a shareholder equivalent to 3 times your annual remuneration, so-called skin in the game. Now, again, if you go and look at King 4, King 4 says nothing about non-executive directors owning shares in the company. There's no, and I think Mark Barnes, who's a director of the Purple Group, if you go to their website, you'll see it says there that Mark is a non-exec director, but he's a significant shareholder of the Purple Group. He's got a lot of skin in the game in relation to that. So that's not contrary to the King 4 code. But what King says is that non-executive directors cannot be incentivized in terms of their remuneration, because then it compromises your independence. Now, if you look at King 3 versus King 4, King 3 was more prescriptive in terms of how you're defined as an independent director. What King 4 did was it took a more perceptual approach. It says that the board needs to really apply its mind to say, how can we justify why this non-executive director is deemed to be independent or not? And the fact that you own shares in the company doesn't necessarily compromise that independence. Now, if we look at Steinhoff, the chair at the time, Christo Wiese, he was a significant shareholder in the company. And so the argument that I made in the article I wrote there, just because you own billions of shares in the company and you're chairing the company doesn't mean that you're necessarily not going to also be blindsided by your CEO. So I think that what King 4 does is it recognizes that governance is complex. And if you are a director, then you need to make sure that an ICRAF says you must be competent to be a director. So you have to commit yourself to lifelong learning. I think that you need to read every single corporate scandal that's ever existed. There's the most fascinating cases that you can read that are sometimes you read this case and you think, wow, you know, this is truth is stranger than fiction. Of 100% shareholders completely destroying companies, marching in and saying that stuff belongs to me. No, it doesn't. It belongs to the company. It doesn't belong to you. Just the fact that you own 100% doesn't give you any more right than anybody else. There's case law about that. So I just also adding that in here, because the question is King 4 guilty or not. If we directors, let's make sure that we are understanding what we're saying, and let's not contribute to creating this impression that it's doing something where it's not in fact. Okay. And I use the mandatory firm rotation and I use the remuneration as an example where these are chairs of listed companies making statements at AGMs. You know, I think they also need to be called out.
I hear you. Frick, do you thank Owen from my side? Thank you. Thanks for also sharing with us your thoughts. I really appreciate it. And I'm quite sure I had got a lot of value out of our discussion. And I do hope our listeners as well. Frick, you want to pull it all together for us?
Yeah, that's my privilege and my task at this moment, Anna-Marie. Thank you, Owen. Thank you so much for doing this. The points that I'm taking out from this, I want to end where you started and say there's much misunderstanding and we need to clarify this. And the point of clarification that I take out of this is that we must be very careful that we don't equate the self-regulatory code with the law. They resonate, but they are two distinctly different things, or they have two different distinct purposes which they serve. The other point that I take out of this is in terms of the board that is responsible to the company as a juristic person and not to the shareholders. That the shareholders own shares, but they don't own the company. And along comes King, who wants to complement that whole venture of business and entrepreneurial spirit with mindful outcomes that complements that and says, if you are driving this as the board, and you have an ethical intent and an entrepreneurial intent, here are guidelines in terms of how to do this in the space so that you can actively, as a collective mind, being the mind, body, and soul of the company, apply your minds, and then balance the needs and the interest of the different stakeholders in the company. Thank you so much. That's what I've taken out of it. I see that we didn't have a lot of questions today because I think it was so interesting to listen to how you logic us towards the destination that there was time to write down a question in the space. But thank you so much appreciated.
Thank you, Frick. Thank you, Owen. Thank you to our listeners. Really great conversation, and maybe be the first of many to come. May we continue this debate. Thank you to everybody, and a good afternoon.